Welcome, everyone, to the Religion Unplugged podcast, which is your regular plug-in for all religion news and culture. And with me today, I have the fantastic Dr. Carolyn Weber, the creative, the kind, the charismatic Carolyn Weber, author of the book Surprised by Oxford, which is now being turned into a feature film on limited release September 27th and October 1st. Welcome to the show, Dr. Weber. Could you just introduce yourself a little bit more to the audience and let them know who you are and what you do a little bit?
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Joseph. That was a fabulous introduction, and I love the alliteration.
It's one of my top 5 skills.
It's a great skill to have. I guess in short, I grew up in Canada and studied in England at Oxford University, and where I became a Christian eventually. I grew up without much of a faith, just kind of a loosely Catholic background. And eventually explored the faith and became a Christian there, and have since lived primarily in the U.S. We had some time back in Canada. I'm married to an American and have 4 children, and I've been a professor of English literature for, 30 years. I'm old, very old, and I love the intersection of faith and literature, those kind of ideas and topics.
That's fantastic. So. Yes. So yeah, for people who don't know your story or aren't familiar with the film, it does follow basically the story you laid out about the movie gives a pseudonym to the character Caro Drake, but it's basically that story of having a not faith upbringing and a very kind of closed off independent spirit from the world, and then going to Oxford. The place, which has its own mystique, but then for Christians has its own, the mystique of that's where C.S. Lewis and Tolkien,
that's
met
true.
and had their, and so what was it about your story? Because not everybody looks at their life and says, oh, this needs to be a book that other people should read. Or if they do,
right.
They don't actually sit down and do it. So what was it that made you say, my story is one that I want to share with other people?
Well, that's a great question. And it's actually Lewis himself who says, when we look back on our lives, we can see God's hand plotting it for each of us. I never anticipated writing a memoir ever. I was an academic, did a lot of academic writing. But over the years, talking to students, sharing my faith, I was nudged quite often to write this story in that way. And at the time, actually, I was coming up for tenure. I started taking it more seriously, wrote sort of an opening couple of chapters, and had been forewarned not to share my story about my Christian faith until I was tenured, until I had job security in secular academia. And so I took that to heart. And then actually, I think it was after having my first baby and then my twins, I thought, you know what, life is too short. I'm going to actually do this on my first sabbatical. And so I did do that with the security of tenure at that point. But I really wrote it from my heart for, Joseph, for my unbelieving friends and family. I didn't anticipate it being, a largely read book. I really wrote it from my heart on that time that I had off from teaching and off from academic studies, where I said I was going to write something academic, but I actually wrote this instead.
So it was, a largely kind of like your story of your coming to faith that was kind of your passion about how showing how that was. And I guess I say, I haven't read your book, be perfectly honest. I watched the movie. I haven't read your book.
That's all right. It's long. It's longer than it should have been. So you're absolutely understandable.
I'm compelled enough by the story. Yeah, I'm compelled enough by the story that I have ambitions to read it at some points. The movie, what's interesting about the...
Well, you'll have to let me know what you think.
Will too. One of the movie is interesting because it does, it's kind of like, a cross between a faith-based film and a Hallmark movie, which, it sounds good on paper. I don't think it works as often in the movie as I'd like it to, but that's just my opinion. But I do it does, the story that does follow the sort of, coming to faith and coming to it through kind of being, encountering different ways of looking at faith than you did growing up. and then having, developing a romantic interest in somebody who is a Christian, just briefly, kind of like, what was the thing about, because like most people, like they think about going to university is where you might lose your faith, so what was it about
Absolutely.
like going to Oxford and the relationships you made there that were that were formative in that way?
Well, absolutely. I think that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write it, was to show that, faith and intellect are not in antithetical relationship to each other, right? There's actually a very rich Christian tradition, intellectual tradition, and that much of the faith really does make sense. But I think part of arriving at Oxford University, being a North American, you're probably aware of this too, right, Joseph, is we're always racing. We're always racing, especially I think as students. We're so distracted and busy, and it's such an opiate of busyness. And when I got to Oxford, of course, there's a high demand placed on you to do your academic work, reading and whatnot. But there's also really a contemplative culture and a culture of conversation, going to pubs, taking time to walk with your friends, talk and think. It's very much built into the life there as part of digesting these ideas. And I felt like a hummingbird that had hit the glass hard. I was working multiple jobs growing up. I was supporting my family, a broken family without a father. I was trying to keep straight A's, that sort of thing. And I think the film alludes to that, but doesn't always show that how for many of us, we can actually be struggling quite a bit more than people realize. I think that's everyone's story in many ways, just in different ways, right? We never know what somebody is carrying. And so to get there and to actually have the time to think, I was not allowed to work for the first year or two of my studies because the British Academy has this crazy idea that students should be students and actually think thoughts and be responsible for them and follow them through and have fellowship and friendship. And so we're sort of faced with our own selves, right? Both that mountain and that abyss when we are actually allowed to sit with the questions that matter.
Great. That's really interesting. So you were able to like sit with some of those more meaningful questions and allowed in space to do that. And that actually allowed you to encounter faith more deeply than.
Right. And to meet a stripe of people, Christians from all over the world. Graduate studies there is particularly cosmopolitan, right? Britain is a commonwealth. So we have this idea that, Oxford must be full of very wealthy students that have somehow elbowed their ways in through their parents or whatnot. But that's not the case, especially for graduate studies. People are coming from all walks of life, and some actually from very poor things. I was on a Commonwealth scholarship, so many of my colleagues were African, whatnot, from all over. But to meet Christians from Germany and Africa and countries of persecution and all sorts of places, all sorts of walks and stripes, in addition to North American Christians and people who were walking their talk, that doesn't necessarily mean they're perfect, but they're trying. Or they have a way in which they're living their lives according to this faith in this idea larger than themselves. And I had never actually seen that up close. I was a perfect example of someone who could go through public school education for 20 years without cracking open a Bible, whose idea of had no concept of the gospel as a personal relationship with Jesus at all, really had no idea of who Jesus was per se, outside of, big-haired TV evangelists who take your money.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. That is often kind of, I find people who come to faith sort of later in life. I mean, by later I meant life, I mean, like when they're young people off at university, is that it's like, I've never actually encountered this before.
Right.
Yeah.
There's the flip side for people who didn't grow up with a faith. Yeah. And conversely, if you have grown up with a faith, university is opening up this whole other vista of experiences, as are other things. That you might not go to college, but you might work with coworkers or whatever else. Right, as you enter into adulthood, and it's about making your faith your own, right? That's the personal relationship part. It's not throwing the baby out with the baptism water per se.
I have not heard it quite put that way before. That's fun. Another aspect of this that I'll be interested in seeing how much this is reflected in your actual real story as it was in the movie. But another parallel track there was sort of the becoming reconciled to God, but also sort of becoming reconciled to men and being able to have, positive relationships with men is something they do a lot, and that's reflected a lot in the movie. And what's funny watching it is that coming out this year, it very much felt to me like the anti-Barbie film, just because that film, I don't know if you watched the movie.
Interesting. I haven't seen that yet.
Just because having watched
I can see
both, and this is not shade on, the Barbie film. You can read my other review for that, but is that the story is very much about, is about sort of creating a split between the sexes and saying like, okay, here's, there really isn't anything good or innate about having positive male-female relationships, and the evils of the patriarchy give reason that there should maybe be a split that's healthier. And so, and yours is very much the opposite, where it's like you start out with all the darkest reasons to be resentful of men, and then slowly getting reconciled to some positive relationships with some men. So like, what was that process like for you, if that's reflective at all, reflective of your story?
Well, that's wow, that's a big question.
You got 5 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. Oh my goodness. And I can see why my students have been clamoring me to watch the Barbie film, and I've been meaning to do that. I think the slippery slope for any of us, right, is seeking our savior in anything except him.
Yes.
So, and we expect the other gender, regardless of how we might define that now, as being the answer for our completeness. And the Bible's never taught that at all, right? I mean, it really does emphasize, that Jesus knows the hearts of men. We are going to disappoint each other as much as we also are going to love each other and bring each other joy, but we are ultimately going to disappoint each other. And we have to have that primary relationship in Christ first. We're so-called married to him first. And that sounded like really creepy language to me before I was a Christian. The whole bride of the church. I mean, that really evokes, Bride of Frankenstein and something all, lurching at you in black and white. But there's really that truth of being grounded in that relationship first, knowing that steadfast love resting in it, because we lose sight of it. We have consolation and desolation, as Lewis says. We move in and out of it all the time. We can't keep it in our line of vision in this fallen world. But creating that relationship and resting in that first and working from there first allows us to extend love and compassion to other people as well as ourselves.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great interview. It's been way too short, but I know you're very busy. What would you like people to get out most from this movie as a final question? If and your book, if people could get one thing out of your story, what would you have to do?
Well, thank you, Joseph, for having me here. I think it would just be to be able to sit with those questions that are within each of us, to know it's safe to ask them. If you're a Christian or a believer, that our God is not a fragile God. You can ask any questions and it won't break him. But also, if you're not, that you would just be able to think about the questions that really matter, the ones that we're often distracted by with so many things in our culture, and that it would be a gentle invitation to that table.
Fantastic. Well, you can see more of, you can read Dr. Carolyn Weber's book for yourself, Surprised by Oxford. And then, of course, if you want to see the movie, you can see that it's in limited release September 27th and October 1st. And I'm sure it will be out on DVD and streaming soon after. Thank you so much again for joining us, Dr. Weber. And thank you all for joining us. Once again, we are Religion Unplugged for your regular religion news and culture.